What's up, guys? Not too long ago, I made a DC superhero versus Marvel villain type video. I mean DC superheroes in like Justice League versus mostly Avengers villains, but like a few other Marvel villains thrown in there. And here I'm doing the opposite, right? Got a little flip to the script. We've got like kind of like a core cast of Avengers and how they generally fare on average against like a lot of either DC villains or like just the heavy hitting like individual villains as well throughout DC. Although I guess kind of every villain in DC is like a Justice League villain to like a certain extent. But you know, some of them are a slightly bigger scale, some of them are a little smaller. Like Ares is more often than not just like a Wonder Woman villain, but same difference. For the Avengers cast that we're going to be talking about, I couldn't find a picture that actually had all the members that I wanted to like include in my like Avengers roster, but I got one that's almost close. For this, we're gonna go with the ones pictured here. So Hulk, Ant Man or Giant Man, Iron Man, Thor, Hawkeye, excuse me, and the Wasp, plus Captain America, of course, instead of Black Panther. Don't really think Black Panther is like a big Avengers character in my mind. He's kind of like Aquaman for the Justice League, where he like has his own stuff to deal with. You know, he kind of only joins, I guess, when it's in the interest of Wakanda. At least that's how I envision it. So yeah, it would be these guys plus Captain America, and we'll also probably give them Scarlet Witch, because I think people generally agree that she's like a pretty core member, or like a very commonly like just a good member to round out the team. And we'll also toss on Vision, I think, just to round it out. I think that's like a pretty solid lineup. That is, I thought. Let me think. Actually, how many is that? It's quite a few more than I think the Justice League team, but these guys are also a little more underpowered, so I don't really mind giving them the benefit of the doubt there. So without all out of the way, let's just go ahead and get started. There's like a 2 minute intro. Starting off with Lex Luthor. So just Lex Luthor by himself, and again, like in terms of like the scenario here, it's not going to necessarily be like a straight like one on one. It just like if they were in the same universe, how often could the superhero team stop the villain's plans, right? So D tier, of course, being they get stopped very consistently, or S tier being like on average the Avengers would not be able to deal with them. Lex Luthor, I think, is pretty easy to handle, or not easy to handle. With prep time, he's like a pretty intimidating person. But the thing about the Avengers, in contrast with the Justice League, is that the Avengers don't really have as many exploitable weaknesses on average. Like, I do have a hard time imagining a situation really where Lex is going to, be able to really exploit any weakness of Thor, aside from, I guess, like Thor's brazenness and like heroic, or I guess like a warrior spirit. Like for the most part, like characters like Thor, and also the Hulk. Like the Hulk is relatively weaknessless, at least compared to the likes of like Superman or Green Lantern half the time. But generally speaking, I think that the Avengers are a little weaker on average, but they make up for that in like not having as like exploitable of weaknesses. And also like in a world where Tony Stark also exists, I do think Lex Luthor is kind of given like a run for his money in terms of intelligence by Tony, um, especially when it comes to like planning fights and just tech stuff in general. Maybe Lex takes the edge in some maybe less important categories. Like, I bet he's like probably a better writer than Tony, but same difference. The point is, I think that I would probably say they probably confidently beat Lex a majority of the time. Anti Monitor does depend a lot on his specific version, right? If we have something like Sinestro Core War Anti Monitor, then they're just gonna pack them up pretty quickly. But I don't think anybody likes to talk about that version of Anti Monitor. I think on average Anti Monitor is probably stomping these guys. I mean, like if we're talking like Crisis Anti Monitor, then they really just don't stand a chance. Assuming base forms, I think that like current Thor or like Odin Force Thor versus Anti Monitor is maybe a little more debatable. Although I would still probably lean towards Anti Monitor winning that. And then I guess Toba Hulk would probably have a solid. I mean, I think like pretty definitively be Anti Monitor just on the fact that he is like kind of beyond scaling. But even then, like we're not taking those versions. We're talking about like a very average like composite of the characters, which I think does tend a little lower than what most people like talk about. I think a lot of people do tend to like to highball characters as much as possible. At least in this conversation, I don't want the highest bald version of each character, because then the team is going to obviously have a huge advantage with the Hulk and Thor. But I think that kind of taking a minute, like a step back and say, like, how we normally see them, like, on average in like a comic book appearance, versus like again, like a reasonable average version that we would see in a comic book run for the villains, right? Not looking to take like the highest end feats for every character. At least if I do, I'll let you guys know the exception. So that being said, Ares is another one who, like, he is, I guess, like a physical threat, certainly more than Lex Luthor, but at the same time, like, he is just not strong enough to deal with the whole of like the Avengers. Honestly, Thor on his own or Hulk on his own is probably enough to beat Ares, but once you throw the rest into the mix, it's like, lights out. And I do think that there's a good number of the Avengers here who are maybe not quite carrying their weight, but there'll be situations for them in the maybe depending on the villain. I guess we will have to see. But Black Adam is certainly more, I think, of a threat than Ares and Lex Luthor. He's very fast, very mobile, and of course, a very powerful character. Magic based does cause, like, I think a lot of problems to the team, and I do think in a straight 1v1 he probably does give either Thor or Hulk like a pretty good run for their money. But with the Hulk and the Thor there together, and the rest of the Avengers supporting them as well, I do think Black Adam probably does not really take the win, especially if you like consider the fact that Thor can control lightning, so maybe there's some interaction there between Thor and the lightning that gives Black Adam his powers. So you can probably go a few different ways with that. Brainiac is, in my opinion, like very comparable to Ultron, and I think that Ultron does at his best give the Avengers like a pretty sick run for their money. But I do think that the Brainiac is significantly less threatening than Ultron, purely by the fact that he has a physical form that can be beaten. Like, Superman just shows up, sees Brainiac's, more often than not, Superman just shows up, sees Brainiac's real form, and then just, like, like, puts him in the dirt. Not killing him, but, like, and comparatively, Ultron is, like, more of a threat because he has all the drones, and, like, he can transfer his consciousness since he's, like, just a computer program, essentially, right? So he can live everywhere. And so that's when you need somebody like Tony or Hank Pym, Ant-Man, to kind of step in and take care of that. Whereas, like, obviously the Hulk and the Thor can deal with the physical aspects of the character. So that being said, I do think that Brainiac, at least for the Avengers specifically, is like a little less of a threat than Ultron, and usually they're able to handle Ultron, so I'm going to put him down here. Amazo definitely depends on the version. I think that Amazo is probably one of the characters that's like a little underutilized in the comic books, but does have some pretty cool like out of comic book appearances. Namely, just like the Justice League TV show, the little cartoon. And if it's that version, then I actually do think that these guys just don't stand a chance. Like, the best you can say is that, like, maybe Ant-Man could shrink down and go turn him off from the inside or whatever. But even in Justice League Unlimited, the Atom tried to shrink himself down, and like, even when he was, subatomic, the Amazo bot was able to find him. So, that being said, like, when you see Amazo in the comics, like, the most notable instance that comes in my mind is, Under the Red Hood. Both the TV show, both the movie and the comic book adaptation, where, he does get pieced by Batman and Nightwing. And so, like, that kind of stuff really makes me think that, Amazo, on average, is not really all he's cracked up to be. I do think that the Justice League TV show version is kind of an outlier. A very cool outlier, I will say. Big fan. But, I think if Batman and Nightwing are taking him down with, like, a batarang to the head, then, the Avengers have a pretty good chance to take care of him. I might just put Ares up one, because I think that these guys are maybe, like, definitively a tier lower. And now we're going to have the Crime Syndicate. I'm pretty sure that's what they call it. I feel like these guys sometimes have different names, but, like, Ultraman, Owlman, and the like. I do think that these guys probably beat the Marvel Avengers on average. Obviously, I think that, like, the biggest threat is going to be Ultraman. Being, comparable to Superman, I think on average he is, maybe causing them trouble. Although it also depends, right? Like, in Forever Evil, Ultraman has, like, a pretty big weakness, which is the sun. And, like, being weak to the sun does, put a damper on things. But, I think we're assuming that these guys are, choosing to do their crime at night or something to, optimize their chances of actually having like a strong effect. That being said, again, Hulk is such a strange character to talk about when it comes to like on average. He's just so variable in every appearance. Sometimes the writers need him to be strong enough to like physically take down anybody, and sometimes he just isn't, right? But I think the point is if the fight goes on long enough, then the Hulk has a pretty easy job. But I think as soon as Ultraman realizes that going blow to blow with Hulk is not going to be fruitful, tossing him into the sun, or I mean just tossing him into space, is going to be like a pretty clear option. And so I think that's like, oh, and of course Owlman being there too is like a pretty big thing, especially again if we're saying like, how often on average can these guys stop these guys? Like if these guys are allowed like appropriate prep time, like villains do take when they can. Owlman is a pretty big problem. Almost like no doubt, like very similar to Batman, but like without the morals, which I think does bode pretty badly for these guys just in general. And like also physical threats. So they're like a pretty well-rounded team, all things considered, and that makes sense given that they're analogs of the Justice League. But I think that's enough for the Crime Syndicate. Darkseid, I think, is like a much, and this is going to be a controversial statement, but we can talk about it sometime in the future. But I think a much stronger version of Thanos, right? Like I think stronger than him in like every iteration where Thanos does not have the Infinity Gauntlet. Or actually, I don't know if Astral Regulator Thanos has the Infinity Gauntlet, but like that version too. Like if I'm talking base forms, Darkseid, even in his weaker interpretations, is beating even like the strongest interpretations of Thanos. That being said, I do imagine that he is probably, ruining these guys in a fight. Omega beams are, I think, underrated. I think unless you have like a crazy amount of invulnerability, the Omega beam is like an instant kill. I think it might be debatable if Hulk would actually survive that because Hulk is like has high regeneration and high stamina, but I think that like on average he's not bulletproof, right? Like if you shoot him, he'll bleed, but it just like won't affect him because he's like so densely muscled and he has like an incredible healing factor. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but I think he would probably get vaporized by an Omega beam, and Omega beam does not leave anything to regenerate. That's at least my like 2 cents on it. You can disagree. I hesitate putting him right in S tier because the Anti Monitor is such a ridiculous step up, and like a character like Thor could probably give Darkseid a good run for his money. And then aside from those two, like again, I don't mean to be like rude to the other members; they're still there. But unless it's like a crazy version of Scarlet Witch, these guys don't really do much. Like the scientific brains of them are not really going to be able to do much against Darkseid because what is there really to exploit? Darkseid doesn't really have any like super exploitable weaknesses. And Captain America's a great leader, but that's kind of what it comes down to. And I guess he can run defense with his shield. Those things could probably block an Omega beam, but Darkseid can just like kind of curve the Omega beam, and he's definitely fast enough to react to Captain America. The only case I could see where you're maybe being like generous to them, and this is like a real stretch, is like if they know he's after the anti-life equation, then maybe like Iron Man or Hank Pym could figure it out. But I also don't think they're like they have the chops to discover like the anti-life equation. I don't really think many people ever do in the comic books. And if they are, they're like ridiculous, like 12th level intellect type stuff. Hard to say who's smarter between Marvel characters and DC characters on average, but that's not really I think worth discussing. So that's kind of where I'll put it. Deathstroke. Now, given prep time, I do think Deathstroke is maybe one of the most like dangerous characters like in DC. Like comparable to Batman, maybe even like more extreme because he's just so like much more ruthless. But there have been comics where like Deathstroke prepped and then was able to like beat up a bunch of like JLA members or Justice League members. I'm not 100% sure, but like he was able to take the ring from I think Kyle Rayner, if I'm not mistaken, and he was able to time it to hit the Flash with like his sword. He's like a really impressive character when he has prep time. And again, in this hypothetical, we're just like assuming they're all in the same world. So presumably, if he's fighting these guys, maybe it's like as a hunt. But Hulk and Thor are probably walling him pretty hard, right? Even Captain America could probably go like band for band with Deathstroke, and Captain America doesn't really have, I think, as exploitable of a weakness. Although, I mean, he could just get shot when he's not paying attention, so that could do it too. So overall, Deathstroke could definitely cause problems, but I don't know if I would say that Deathstroke is beating them more times than he's not. Doomsday, on the other hand, is I think a little more of a threat for them than like most of the characters we've talked about so far. Insane durability and regeneration, and I just don't think that the members of the Avengers have the firepower to beat him on average. Again, with the exception of the Hulk, and then with the Hulk, he does get angrier the longer it goes, and so I guess for that reason, maybe there is a good chance that Hulk would eventually get angry enough to just win. And also, out of bounds, I think does count as like a victory. If you just pick up Darkseid and you toss him into like into space, then that's like a pretty good way to win. And also, I think that the Hulk could certainly stall Doomsday long enough that the rest of the Avengers, especially the smarter ones, could come up with some sort of containment plan. So I actually maybe I would drop him down to Avengers taking care of him more than not, but I can definitely imagine there being casualties. Eclipso, I was really hesitant to include Eclipso on this list because he is such a strange character, and I really don't know how to scale him. But like on average, I guess he's like maybe even as powerful as Darkseid, maybe stronger, right? But like his whole thing is his corruption, and so how would that interact with these characters? I'm not actually sure. I think Eclipso is maybe like a bit of a bit out of my knowledge when it comes to discussing. I just have like the vaguest idea that he's like generally like a pretty big physical threat. And then he does also have his whole manipulation thing. But that being said, he has like a pretty exploitable weakness, right? In that he has a connection to that dark heart or whatever. But you know, like how exploitable that will be, I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure with Eclipso. Just take it with a grain of salt. Here we have the Injustice League is what I meant to represent this as. And for this, I think I would probably go with the core lineup that's like introduced in Forever Evil. So that's going to be, and I'm probably going to forget a few people here, but like Captain Cold, Black Manta, Lex Luthor, Black Adam, Bizarro, and I feel like I'm missing like one more heavy hitter. Oh yeah, Sinestro. Um, Pretty solid lineup, very strong. Black Adam's in there, Sinestro and Bizarro. Those guys I think are definitely giving these guys a pretty big run for their money. And then on top of that, they have like the leadership of Lex Luthor. The only thing that you might say for this is like, this is like a very dysfunctional group in that they would probably like bicker a lot. But honestly, Lex Luthor does a really good job of controlling these guys. Bizarro obviously is not really going to be a problem when it comes to that. But you would think like Black Adam and Sinestro are maybe a little too egotistical, but yeah, they kind of take orders well. And again, like Forever Evil, I think Lex does a pretty good job of rallying these guys and getting them to work towards a common goal without like with a minimum amount of infighting. So I actually think that I would probably put their chances of winning above the Crime Syndicates for that reason. They also just have the strength in their like three heavy hitters, I think, to really like mess with Hulk and Thor. Again, I know I talk about Hulk and Thor a lot, but like they are on the high end here. Iron Man isn't like an unimpressive character when it comes to physical feats by any means, but like an average Mark 42 or whatever the standard armor is for Iron Man is it's not quite stepping up to the rest of the heavy hitters, but he is also worth considering, right? Like it's not like he's not there, but you know, with like the electric powers of Shazam, or sorry, Black Adam, and Lex Luthor's like technical prowess himself. Will it really matter? I'm not so sure. Bizarro also I don't think has the same magical weakness as Superman. I could be wrong on that, which makes him more of like a strong contender for Thor. But that being said, the Hulk could really step it up here. And now I'm thinking about it, I do maybe have a hard time imagining the Injustice League having a super consistent way to beat the Hulk outside of like teleportation or out of bouncing him. But those are the kind of plans that you can expect Lex Luthor to come up with. Again, while Hulk doesn't have any like really exploitable weaknesses, if you're strong enough to take some hits and just like toss him into space, that is a win because he can't come back from that. I feel like I've heard people say it, and maybe I've seen it in like not a death battle, but in something before that like Hulk can just use his like thunderclap or whatever to get back if he's in space. But like I think that's like just not true. I mean, I could get we could get a physics check on this, but like I'm pretty sure like clapping against the emptiness of space doesn't do anything because there's no there's no air to push back, right? Like you need to push off of something, whatever it is. So I think I'm giving it to Hulk does maybe turn this though the Hulk is like a pretty ridiculously hard to take down character. You know, okay, maybe I am dropping them down. Maybe I'm saying it's like a situational type, like kind of a tie, maybe 50-50 on wins. Mongol is not as physically threatening as Darkseid, and certainly not even as physically threatening as Doomsday either. Also, not really that smart. Like certainly not as smart as some of the other characters. Mongol's not really much of a physical threat, right? Like you introduce him in the story if you want some fun war world type shenanigans, not for his like physical threateningness or his brain. Here I have Parallax Hal Jordan. I don't think there's really much to talk about here. He just like fully whoops like a base form Avengers. Again, maybe not fair, right? Because here I'm talking like a base like average Avengers and like an absolutely like giga cranked villain. But I'm not trying to make any statements here about like Avengers being weak or strong, right? I'm gonna just pick a few characters that I thought would be fun to talk about. Actually, I think I'd probably bump him up a tier. Pretty sure that Parallax Hal Jordan was like in his own right, like kind of like a crisis level threat. Again, maybe controversial, but like very few times in like those old comic books where you would get Spectre to try to step in and like put a stop to things. And the two that come to mind are Crisis on Infinite Earths and then Parallax Hal Jordan. So Pariah is another character that is like pretty ridiculously weird because he's just all over the place. But like physically he seems pretty impressive, and then also like his whole like control of the Great Darkness, ability to enslave people, like probably just means he's a little too much for the base Avengers to handle. But again, I think I will like emphasize that if we're using like Toba Hulk, then these guys are all down here, with the exception of maybe the Anti Monitor. No, actually, Toba Hulk handles him too. Like Toba Hulk definitely whoops all these guys. Current Thor from like Immortal Thor probably I would say like caps at Darkseid, like he beats Darkseid, and then maybe it's like a little controversial how he fares against these guys, but I would be inclined to think he probably does beat them, but that's neither here nor there. Again, we're talking about like kind of a base composite form. Reverse Flash is definitely a big problem for them. A hard character to tag, even with Thor's speed feats. I think that they have like a really difficult time handling this level of like speed. They don't have a Flash equivalent. I didn't give them Quicksilver, but frankly, even if they had Quicksilver, it wouldn't matter. Could Scarlet Witch do anything magical here? I mean, magic is so vague, right? But it's not like Scarlet Witch is not like spells in the same way that like Doctor Strange is. She's not like as versatile to my knowledge, right? She's like a little more of the grabby, throwy, explodey type spells. So I think that they have a pretty hard time catching Zoom. That being said, could Zoom really hurt them? Not really, but Zoom could do some pretty crazy stuff with the Speed Force, right? Like I'm pretty sure he can like throw people into the Speed Force, if I'm not mistaken. So that's like a way he could out of bounds some of the stronger characters. And then it's like hard for Hulk to escape that. I put the Sinestro core because I don't know. Maybe I was subconsciously hating on the Avengers and really wanted to just like give them as many hard fights as possible. I feel bad about it. Oh, actually, maybe I'm being a little silly here because Sinestro Corps is really just Sinestro. Like, there's not like I dare the average comic book viewer to really name any other like permanent Yellow Lantern members other than Sinestro. Obviously, when these guys had Anti Monitor and Superboy Prime, that would be a problem. But as they are, it's just kind of Sinestro and his gang. And I actually think that Thor and Hulk probably run them pretty easily. Not that easily, but pretty easily. Starro is not like far from that physically impressive. He's certainly no slouch, but I think that one good hammer shot to the eye and this guy probably explodes. So I'll probably put him here as well. Superboy Prime again. Now I'm starting to feel a little bad about this, but Superboy Prime does like fully and wholehandedly stomp them. I actually also would go so far as to say that Superboy Prime beats current Thor as well. Again, Toba Hulk is just like ridiculous exception to everything, but Superboy Prime definitely, in my opinion, beats every other version of the Hulk pretty like handedly. Trigon's a weird character to talk about. Like again, they do have Scarlet Witch, but if it's not like a super rage Scarlet Witch, he's just not like in the realm of something they could ever deal with. Just a little too strong. Maybe around Darkseid level. And then General Zod. Now General Zod's actually like an interesting one to talk about because he's like a more skilled version of Superman in terms of his combat ability. So then this does come down to like the old like Thor versus Superman debate which I think if you're using like a base composite version of Thor, probably does lean more towards Superman. And then even same with the Hulk fight, but to fight both of them at the same time with the other members of the Avengers kind of standing in there, I think it's just maybe a little too difficult. So probably also going to drop him in the C tier. So overall, I think that they would handle like a good number of the villains pretty well, especially like the normal everyday villains. The only like like composite versions of like villains that would give them trouble are probably Reverse Flash, Darkseid, and then the Crime Syndicate. I guess Trigon too, but that hardly even counts. Like these guys are just like kind of one off, not one off, but like very infrequently occurring like super giga strong characters, and same with the guy in S tier. So I actually do think that they probably handle the average Justice League villain pretty well, all things considered. They have outs to some of the bigger threats like Doomsday, Black Adam, General Zod. So overall, I think that they would actually fare pretty well. Again, I just include these characters because I like to talk about them. But I can understand that maybe this is like a little unfair and maybe it gives like a bad picture. But I think that this was just a fun little like conversation to have, and I did enjoy it. I've got like a fun little Marvel versus DC villain in the works for my next video. I don't know exactly when I'm gonna finish it. I did like kind of like storyboard it all out. I just have to finalize some of the visuals for it. But hopefully that will come out soon. Hoping to like keep posting somewhat regularly now that I've kind of settled down and I've figured out that this is something I can like do every now and then. But it'll remain to be seen. A lot of rambling, so I think I'm just gonna end the video here. But thank you guys for watching. Hope you guys have a good day.